Hello, everyone. We'll get started in just a few. Thank you for joining us today. Maybe just another minute and we'll get started again. Thank you so much for joining us today. Seeing several folks who've joined us before. If you're joining us for the first time, we appreciate you so much. Thanks for spending a portion of your afternoon with us. I see Val, I see Nicole. I think I saw Peggy. Thanks everyone for joining us. There's Terry. Appreciate you all so much. Okay, welcome. My name is Kenny Taylor. I am a faculty member here at the Bush School at Texas A&M. Again, thank you so much for joining us. This is part of our series of webinars that we do in the fall and spring semesters here. And we've been able to do those for probably the last 4 or 5 years. So again, we thank all of you all who are joining us who have been in the past, and also those of you all that are joining us for the first time. We hope that what we present is insightful for you. Today's session will be on leading successfully in times of change and uncertainty. So we're certainly hearing from several organizations about some of the things that they're going through, and we felt like the topic was timely. This is actually one that I've hinted on and also talked about some in the past. As you could imagine, nonprofit sector, the public service sector, are always in flux. Change hits us, disasters happen, economic downturns tend to affect nonprofit and public service organizations in a way that they might not with for-profit and corporations. So again, we feel like this is a timely topic, and we'll certainly save some time on the back end to open up questions. And also, if you do have questions, feel free to insert those in the chat. We'll get to those, as many as we can anyways, toward the end of the presentation. And also don't hesitate to introduce yourself in the chat as well. Let me give you just a little bit of information about our center. The Center for Nonprofits and Philanthropy supports a vibrant nonprofit and philanthropic sector here in the state of Texas and beyond through research, professional outreach, and engaged learning. We have some upcoming events that we'd like to just reference real quick. So next month in April, we'll have our webinar about leadership and the power of transformation, same time as today, 12 noon to 1 p.m. On May 13th, we'll have another session on unlocking systems thinking, so tools for transformation. And on May 29th, we'll have our leadership and board service program, which is a fee-based opportunity that we provide here in person at the Bush School, but also online. This one will be on Zoom, and it's approximately 3 hours in the afternoon from 1 to 4 p.m. Okay, in terms of getting into some of the topic for today, certainly what's on the mind of nonprofit and public service professionals are or have to do with the economic uncertainty that we're currently experiencing and probably more in front of us. And so part of what I think about as a faculty member here at the school, of course, is leadership. And sometimes we get so boiled into what's going on externally at our organizations when we forget to think about what we need to do, what we should be prepared for, and individually what that means for us as leaders. So, what leader or leadership responsibilities do we have or that we have to address in times of change? And so, my guess is many of you all that are joining us today have heard these things before. But I think that it's good that we provide information like this in terms of a reminder of what we need to think about individually as leaders before we can get to some of those higher level things that we need to concern ourselves with, specifically regarding those that we lead, so groups and teams, and certainly before we can broadcast that out further, especially those of us that are in the nonprofit and public sector. So, what leadership responsibilities do we have to address in times of change? We hope that we provide you with some tips today of things just to keep in mind that we should be considering as things present themselves to us that we can't avoid and have to do with just the environment in which we operate. So, though we certainly need to address team and organizational level issues during these times, we certainly can't abandon our individual obligation as leaders. And so, much of the leadership studies research suggests that the first level of leadership begins at the individual level. And so, what we need to think about is one's ability to influence and motivate others toward mission advancement, and how that could be compromised without self exploration as a leader. And so, again, the things that I think about related to leadership, the study of leadership, as we work with students, as we work with professionals, is, again, in my opinion, that it's very easy to not think about ourselves and the responsibilities that we have as leaders because we're so focused on those that we serve. And I'm not saying that that's a bad thing. We should be in the public service and the nonprofit sector, but absolutely we cannot forget about what our responsibility is as individual leaders. So, what do we keep in mind? Any of us that stop for just a second and reflect on things that have happened over the last decade in terms of turbulence or extreme change, disasters, that these times are always not too far down the road in the nonprofit and public sector. So let's say before the situation that many nonprofit and public service organizations are in today, in terms of some that are pretty extreme in terms of going out of business, nonprofit organizations that have lost money and had to go through layoffs. Well, just a few years back, we were having these same conversations during COVID times. And also, if we think about here in the state of Texas, Hurricane Harvey and how that impacted nonprofit organizations. I didn't do much of an introduction about my background other than being a faculty member here at the Bush School. But some of those of you that are joining us today know about my time at Big Brothers Big Sisters for 12 years, leaving there as the CEO of Big Brothers Big Sisters over in Austin. One of the things that we got in the habit of is trying to budget for disasters that were unknown to us. So how do we keep that even in our budget to make sure that we address those things knowing that they're on the horizon versus waiting for something to happen and then trying to address them afterwards? So to that point, turbulent times seem to always be right down the road for those of us that work in the nonprofit and public sector, or at least nonprofits and public sector institutions seem to be impacted maybe harder than some for-profit or corporate environments are. And so effective leadership really requires that people adapt their styles to the demands of different situations. So we'll talk a little bit more about how we perform, how we engage as leaders in different situations. So we'll talk about that as well too. Um, and also just to keep in mind that leaders are ultimately judged on their performance during and following tough times. And the way that I tend to think about, that particular bullet point is it's easy to be in the seat uh, and lead or have the position that you do when things are fine. But uh, I would imagine that as any of us have sat down with those that we report to, how you responded in turbulent times is extremely important to how you're judged in terms of your performance, all the way up to maybe even keeping your job. So we can't help ourselves but to go to how did someone act, lead when things were tough versus just sitting in the seat when I don't want to say nothing is going on because, of course, in the nonprofit and public sector, there's always a level of urgency as professionals within this space to serve those that we need to. But again, ultimately, we're judged on our performance during those tough times. And the one thing, of course, that this makes me reflect on is in one of our sessions that we had here, um, General Joe Ramirez fondly said, we're also paid to lead as well, too. So even though we raise our hands to serve and to lead, why this is important is because we're also paid to do so. So we want to make sure that, or to the extent that we can, investing in professional development, uh, 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 attending maybe opportunities like this and all those other things that you do to stay on top of your game are extremely important. And again, just a reminder not to forget about what our individual responsibility is, regardless of what's going on out there in the world. So let's get into talking about self-leadership for just a few. So when I think about self-leadership, I think about the behaviors that we take on. Now, self-leadership can come in many forms, but kind of the way that it breaks down is, what behavior do we take on as leaders? And in the leadership academic literature, behavioral approach or behavioral leadership is something that's fairly prominent and been around for a while when we look at research studies, particularly in this space. And the way that it tends to break down has to do with identifying our core values. So, trying to assure that our personal values are interwoven with our leadership development activities. And it just so happens that yesterday, in having a conversation with students, core values, it's just really cool to see one and really interesting to hear younger generations' thoughts on their values. And so, uh, really based on my personal experience in the nonprofit space, I know that over the years, I didn't always work with people who desired to do nonprofit or public service work. They just kind of ended up in the space a bit. The young folks that I'm talking to here at the school, they're saying they're not even considering or taking jobs if their values don't align with these organizations, tough times or not, they're just not doing it. So, you know, I tend to think of myself as, someone older and more mature in the nonprofit sector. So with that said, uh, reminding ourselves about core values is extremely important. So as we try to develop as leaders, the question is, do we understand our values along the way? We don't compromise our values. And as we're developing, have we incorporated how we feel about things, who we are as people, that we've reflected on being aware of who we are and that we only engage in development activities and the work that we do that align with our values. So exploring what those values are, even though, yes, we all know ourselves, but on a daily basis, how is that incorporated into what you do to develop as a professional, and then also the routineness of the work that you do. Do your values align with what you have to do on a daily basis, and also who you are responsible for leading? Another behavioral approach that's talked about in the academic research has to do with one's leadership narrative. So this is really who you and others, or how you and others narrate who you are as a leader. And so sometimes we get uh, 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 two different stories. So we tend to know ourselves, we think about ourselves in a certain way. If somebody asks us who we are as a leader, usually we're able to say that. But an important question that goes with that is, if you go and ask someone who reports to you, or someone asks someone who reports to you, how they describe you as a leader. And I think the way that the academic literature relates to it or relays it is, are you talking the same language? Are you described in the same ways? Or are you described differently by others than the way that you describe yourself? So one of the things that we can work on behaviorally is making sure that when we walk through the door, when we show up, that they say the same things about you that you say about yourself. And if we figure out in terms of how we're rated as a leader, when we ask others, if you know that there's something that seems to be off, how we can get closer to establishing not just a narrative, but a consistent narrative around how people describe us as leaders and how we describe ourselves as leaders. And I guess the easiest way maybe to kind of to think about that is uh, people that you know. I won't ask you to think about yourself, but anyone that you know that one day they act a certain way and you want to be around them, and another day they act a different way and you don't want to be around them. And how consistent or inconsistent is that in this entire process, I guess, called leadership? One of the other pieces that tends to stick out when we're talking about behavioral leadership or the behavioral approach to leadership is having an authentic foundation. And this one, of course, is anyone who knows me, is really important to me. My dissertation research is kind of based around authentic leadership behaviors, particularly in the nonprofit space. Um, we already talked about, or mentioned anyways, being self-aware. So when we ask ourselves, what are the constructs of being authentic related to leadership? It certainly has to do with being self-aware. So exploring who you are, reflecting on who you are. It's beyond that, of course, but that's just a starting point. Another construct of the authentic foundation or authentic leadership has to do with being transparent. So think of any of these constructs as, if someone rated you on transparency, what would they say about you? If someone rated you on, to what extent or how consistent are you in engaging others in decision-making processes before you make a decision as a leader? How consistent are you with asking others before you make a decision? Or are you consistent at just making decisions and having not engaged anyone in that process with you? So the authentic foundation of being self-aware, how one would rate or gauge your morals and ethics. How transparent are you? To what extent do you engage others in decision-making processes? Are all part of that being authentic, again, in relation to what type of leader are you? So I present none of this to say you need to subscribe to a certain type of behavioral approach. It's really just to say there's several varieties of leadership approaches that one can take on. But particularly if we get into the behavioral stuff, one reason I like the behavioral stuff is we all personally control that. We can build certain values. We can work on and build our leadership narrative. We can try to become more authentic. Those are things that we can personally control. So if we have the opportunity to do that as leaders, that's a good thing. That means that everyone has the opportunity to, if it's something that you're interested in. So I mentioned that I would come back to the situational approach, but situational approach aligns with, behavioral leadership as well too, because just like I mentioned, we're rated or graded how we perform in tough times. The leadership literature goes really right to, it's easy to lead when nothing is going on. When something situationally is going on, we need to understand that those different situations usually require different types or kinds of leadership. And so, as a model, basically what it states is that effective leadership requires leaders to adapt their styles to the demands of different situations. And any of you all, of course, can, reflect on what someone did in a particular situation that stuck with you, that spoke to who they were or are as a person, how they led through a certain time. It's not easy to see, but when you see it or when you've experienced it, it tends to be something that sticks with us. So understanding that situational approaches, a situational leadership model, this is important because we have to act and behave in different ways depending on what's going on. And it's something that we can really get a true rating on. So again, when the semester, just using a personal example, when the semester is in and we're teaching classes, how we lead during that time in the classroom with students is probably a bit different than some of those administrative things that we need to get done, let's say over the summer. So depending on what situation is at hand, viewing ourselves in different ways, understanding when we need to adapt is all part of what, again, we need to keep in mind. But specifically related to the situational approach, it really gets into what type of behaviors we should take on or what it recommends we should consider. And those are directive behaviors and supportive behaviors. As stated with directive behaviors, when we say or give direction to someone, go do this, establishing goals, understanding what needs to be accomplished at our organizations, and setting timelines. Of course, this will vary from situation to situation and organization to organization, but just remember that we're only I'm only really kind of scratching the surface related to all the details related with a certain approach. But really what this has to do with in terms of the directive and supportive behaviors has to do with also meeting those that you lead, those that you're responsible for, where they are in terms of their development. So one easy way to kind of think about both of these different behaviors is, we usually need to give directions to someone who's newer on the job. We usually need to give specific directions to folks when we're implementing something new at our organizations, even if they've been around for a while. Supportive behaviors, I think, especially in the nonprofit and public service space, we can't forget about. And many times we do when we're in crisis situations, but we can't forget that supportive behaviors, helping people, helping individuals and groups feel comfortable about who they are, their co-workers, and the situation via, two-way communication and employing social and emotional support, I think is highly important in the nonprofit and public service space. Again, I say all of this as someone who has been a nonprofit professional. I stopped there because I saw a note that I was muted. Let me just do a quick check that everybody can hear me. If somebody would just put a thumbs up real quick for me. I see Susan. Okay, good. Thank you, Susan. I appreciate you. Okay, so not to get off track is just to keep in mind, especially in the nonprofit and public service space, supportive behaviors are really important. And the example that I wanted to provide is this is something that, early in my career, I got in trouble with because I wanted to lead my organization, my nonprofit organization, from a business standpoint or with a business perspective. And it was all about the strategy that we have and how many people we needed to serve and all these metrics we were going to track. And then someone reminded me it was vital for my development at the time. Someone reminded me that, Kenny, 3/4 of your staff, we're here to help people. So seeing this in the leadership literature in terms of supportive behaviors, even in times of crisis, we cannot forget that those that we're leading, those that are there with us, we can't forget about the emotional and the social support. Again, I think specifically in the environment that I believe most of us are in, nonprofit and public settings. Okay, again, I'm really scratching the surface a bit related to some of these different theories. So I'm just pulling out pieces. I would encourage you, we'd be happy to provide, more details about any of these. But again, I'm guessing these are approaches, things that you've seen before. So if another behavioral approach, the adaptive leadership approach, and here this stresses the behaviors of leaders in relation to the work of followers, kind of back to the situational stuff. It has to do with where followers are at, where employees are at, understanding that we need to have or turn on certain behaviors based on where those that we lead are at professionally. And so uh, the adaptive approach is used to explain how leaders encourage productive change across multiple levels. And again, kind of back to ourselves as leaders, organizationally, productive change in our community or the communities that we serve, and larger societal issues that we engage in. And not my word, but word that's used in the literature has to do with the leader not being a savior, but certainly one who plays the role of assisting people who need to confront tough problems. So back to kind of where we started, we know about ourselves individually, we develop as leaders, and until we do that, it's tough to go up from that point from or to team leadership or group leadership without addressing our own stuff first. Okay, so leading change, we'll talk a little bit about that. So instead of getting too into the weeds in terms of uh, leading change, what does that mean and what are the performance dimensions? It's pretty simple. Ask yourself, or others will ask, did they make things happen? And in the end, did they get the job done? So back to whatever it is that we might go through, whatever disaster that struck, uh, whoever was at the helm, did they get the job done? So with making things happen, when we say, what does that mean? Did we organize the work? We talked about directing already. So giving people direction, implementing actions that minimize the impact of a threat. Along the way, after whatever is over, uh, will people say, will those that you were responsible for leading say, I'm glad they minimized that thing that could have been way worse. I'm glad they told me what to do because that helped me grow as a leader and professionally. Things felt really organized, even though we were dealing with such a big issue. Real simple. What's the performance dimension? You got to make stuff happen as a leader. Again, in the end, if we can call it that, Did we get the job done? So forging cooperation between previously unrelated agents and enabling workarounds when routines and resources don't work. So, thinking back on COVID a bit, you know, I can think of many people in the nonprofit space that have stumped the ground for decades saying nonprofit organizations need to partner with one another. Nobody, holistically anyways, we're all so passionate about our individual and respective missions, finding ways to work together, pretty tough, I would, surmise anyways. During COVID, organizations were forced to work together. So we'll just say use that as an example. But how do we forge cooperation in terms of, again, back to when disasters strike or bad things happen or operating in tough times, as leaders, were we able to bring people together that haven't worked together in the past because the times call for that? And in doing so, even if not working together and forging partnerships inside of our own agencies or institutions, were we able to find workarounds? Because personally, as leaders, we can get caught up in it. So just think about other employees and how easy it is for those folks to be so focused on the routineness of their job duties. And how do we break that up in trying times? Uh, in the end, it's one of those performance dimensions of, can we get people out of their routineness when we need stuff to happen because something bad is going on out there in the world? And whether it be making things happen or getting the job done, that symbolic role, we talk about that a lot. I'm sure many of you all play that role at your organizations for your community. But just to remember that in these times, fulfilling a symbolic need for direction and guidance is highly important. That you're visual, that you're seeing, the community knows what you're doing because you're active in that space related to addressing what's going on, again, in our respective communities. Okay, so back to where we started in terms of performing and thinking about assessment when bad stuff happen. I would say that, these next few things, which will wrap us up, have to do with things to keep in mind or tips to keep in mind related to working in times of crisis, working in times of uncertainty, and something to just, what I hope will be takeaways related to um, what our expectations are, performance expectations are, again, when something bad is going on, when disaster strikes, when we lose money, when we are really close to dissolving our organizations, when we have no board, when staff walks away, whatever it might be. But again, we have lots of stuff to reflect on. Any of you all as individuals, again, in the public service space, I know that there's something that sticks out to you in terms of a bad time that you went through with your organization, whether it's the one you're with now or had been at in the past. What should we know? What should we do? Okay, so I'm just pulling from really one article that has stuck with me related to change, uncertainty, and tough times at organizations. And these 10 things that we'll go through just really have to do with, if you ask yourself, in the end, once you get through a big loss of money or whatever it is at your organization, whatever you want to reflect on during these times, and let's just say your board is meeting or your supervisor is meeting with other directors at the organization, one of the things that will certainly come up is, did you have any awareness that this was on the horizon? So what type of leader foresight do you have right now at the organization that you sit in, if responsible for thinking about the future at your organization, what type of foresight do you have related to things that you've identified that could lead to a crisis? Um, what is that for you? Um, what have you done? What work? What have you written down? What have you identified in any of your long range plans, short range plans, bylaws, procedures, whatever it might be? What type of foresight did you have related to, regardless of what it was that presented itself, that we had to get over? So leader foresight is something, because it's a very easy response to say, nobody saw COVID coming. No one saw the reduction in force and money going away from government contracts to support our public service and nonprofit organizations, maybe some. But those that were ahead of the game, I was with the nonprofit leader the other day that said, we've never relied on federal funding. And she personally felt like she was in a good spot, regardless of what's going on right now related to funding at her organization. So sense making. So are there methods in place, or do you as a leader have methods in place to process and share information in a timely manner? So what do you have in place? How do you operate? Is it, I'm not saying it's a bad thing, because I certainly do a lot of this, but off the cuff, do you have methods in place? Is off the cuff good enough? Or are there things written down that you have a process in place to share information when something happens? And I can say that, again, because I was in the youth serving industry, we absolutely had those things in place, because we always thought about it in terms of a kid could get hurt. And if a kid gets hurt, somebody is going to put a microphone in front of your face. And how do you respond? And not only having a process to share information and it being timely, it also needs to be accurate as well. So one of the things that we also tend to get into a bit is when there is a need for leaders to make critical decisions. Now, all I'll say with this is that we have to concern ourselves with strategic issues. We talk about this a lot. I think early before we started the presentation today, we talked about our leadership and board service opportunity that we have here. And one of the things that we talk about that's a responsibility of board members, but certainly those of us that are in leadership roles, is not to get into the weeds, not to get into the operational stuff. When something critical is going on, we need to concern ourselves with strategic, larger issues versus the operational stuff. And that needs to be pretty clear cut, because we tend to have people that can do the operational stuff. We need to get out of the big hole that we're in related to whatever is going on at a particular time, when we need to concern ourselves with these issues. Um, Facilitating or orchestrating vertical and horizontal coordination. And so facilitating effective cooperation and intervening as needed. And so I think the point here is the cooperation. We talked about partnerships just a little earlier. So how do we facilitate cooperation between and amongst organizations when we need to get through things together? And sometimes that works really well. If we've never had to do it until disaster strikes, many times that can be a dysfunctional process. Okay, if there is the potential for that process to be dysfunctional, how have you positioned yourself to make sure that it isn't, and that it's more effective than it is? Again, just back to the word dysfunctional, I guess. Making sure that cooperation is effective amongst those of us that are in the space that have to work together on behalf of our community. And those of you all that work in that space, you know how complicated that can be. Coupling and decoupling, monitoring the state of critical systems. So Again, one of the things we tend to talk about is what systems do you have at your organization that absolutely have to operate for you to be able to get down the road and advance your mission. And so whatever all those systems are, programs in relation to fund development in relation to HR, staffing related to HR. What are those critical systems at your organization? So one, it's understanding what all those systems are in your respective environments, and then making sure how they connect to one another is prioritized in the process or during these times that are troubling for us. Again, we're talking performance expectations, disaster struck, you made it through it, your board is sitting there, they're discussing, well, how did Susan do? How did Royce do? Did Royce make meaning of providing hope and confidence? How one is intended to lead the organization and community out of the crisis. So you and your community and your responsibility to folks understanding, they see you, you're the one making sense out of all this stuff. They see you as someone who's bringing hope to getting out of the situation that we're in. Did you do that? Communication, ensuring communication professionals have accurate information for the public. So again, back to I can certainly provide a personal reflection on this. When I was a CEO of Big Brothers Big Sisters over in Austin, my director of marketing, we had an extremely close relationship, because anytime that something went wrong, especially when kids are involved, I mean, I'm sure that applies in a lot of different settings. But for me, it had to do with kids getting hurt. We had understanding, we had policies, we had it written down. If Kenny is not available, Melanie does it. If Melanie's not available, Kenny does it. Who is the outlet? Who's responsible for these communications outlet? Who are responsible for those communication outlets? But just ensuring that if you as the leader, you're so busy, you don't have the time to do all of this, you have to have others that you can count on. So with that said, do you have an understanding, a good relationship that's, again, not just accurate information, but also timely? Are you staying ahead of the game related to things that you know you need to address? Are you going to sit on those, or are you going to be proactive? Rendering accountability. So providing transparent account of, this one's tough, but being able as a leader to provide transparent account of your actions or inactions before and during the crisis. So let's see, Duchess, you're at a board meeting, and are you able to sit there and account for your inactions because you know that you did something that wasn't exactly right or correct during the time? Now, I know you never do that, but that said, are you okay with this? One is tough. I mean, I struggle with it myself, right? But we all have to do it. Can you account for stuff that you did not do in a transparent way is the bottom line question. Okay, so learning, reflecting on actions and a willingness to tolerate negative feedback, kind of the same stuff. I mean, are we as leaders able to take the negative feedback, and do we learn from it? I've heard some people describe it as run toward negative feedback because you need that stuff. But on a daily basis, even though I'm sitting here being the one that's presenting this stuff, negative feedback is tough. But I tend to go to, in the nonprofit and public service space, it's that much more important that we get comfortable with this. And then lastly, enhancing resilience, having to do with there's a shared belief of overcoming future obstacles. So if we do we're okay with being transparent around our actions and inactions, the good and the bad. And if we are willing to tolerate the negative feedback, hopefully what that leads to is we incorporate that into the culture of our organizations to where we're able to enhance our resiliency for the next time that something presents itself that we need to get over. That's all I have. I'll stop sharing there. And I haven't been able to pay attention to the chat, but I know that we certainly have amazing staff members here that probably have. But with that, I'll certainly open it up to questions, and I'll take a look at the chat, if at all, and see if there's anything that we need to talk about with what we presented today. So again, any questions or anything that I missed?
There's one question in the chat
Okay.
from Valadia.
Is that Val?
Yes. Hello, Dr. Taylor. It is me.
Hey, good to
Hi.
see you.
Thank you so much for the webinar. It's very, very insightful. So I actually just got back from a grant conference, and this was just like a huge theme in all the sessions that we were in, especially because, you know, this new administration is, you know, they're really rocking the grants world. So one thing that you mentioned that really resonated with me was about just like supporting your staff through like conversations and check-ins. So like with all these constant changing, I guess like the changing landscape, what would be a good way in which nonprofit leaders can support the well-being of the staff and especially prevent burnout?
It sounds like you're doing the right thing if you're stopping and making time just to have conversations with folks. To me, that was something that just always went a long way. In, you know, trying times or whatever it might be, usually some leaders will default into, we don't have time for that. And, or even if you don't say that out loud, you're not carving out and scheduling time for that. So what I would say is you know, don't overthink it and keep it fairly simple. And fairly simple just means carve out specific time to have those conversations, because as a leader, the only way that you can provide emotional or social support, if that's what it is, or, you know, support that's specifically related to their work responsibilities, you need to make sure that you're keen and aware of what those things are. And as sure as you know what those things are, as a leader, you'll do the right thing. I think what happens is we just miss what those things are, because we aren't able to. And then, you know, do your darndest to try to go and get, if it's something specific that you have to invest in. Sometimes it could be a professional development training. Many times it involves money. You know, have you set aside, you know, financial resources for trainings or whatever it might be that you can support your staff with. You just never know what it's going to be. It might be, can I bring my pet to work? You just never know what all that is. Do I need a day off? If you don't know those things and you're grinding in the midst of a, you know, whatever it was, it's easy to overlook some of those things. So that's probably about what I would offer up for you, Val.
Thank you. Great answer.
Good to see you. How about is that
Hi.
Tana?
Yes, thank you. And hello, thank you for the great training today, Professor Taylor. Love it. And it came at a perfect time. And Val, to reflect kind of on what you were saying as well, For those of you that don't know, my name is Tana Plesher. I'm the president and CEO of Grace After Fire. We're a nonprofit specifically for women veterans and their families as they transition out of the military. And so these are trying times. Earlier you had mentioned that early on in your nonprofit, you ran it, you led from a more of a business perspective and not the humans perspective. I find myself, especially in recent weeks, having and being the recipient of almost a level of intolerant behavior of being the leader of an organization such as Grace After Fire, from those that come from a business, more corporate background. So if you have any experience, what are your recommendations on how to move forward and address those obvious concerns? But, any recommendations for, additional communication styles to help, ease those conversations? Because it's kind of right now, it's a lot of, being directed, but not being receptive to the response of their questions, that we're kind of running into.
Yeah, I feel you. I'll start with that. That's a balance that leaders, especially again in the nonprofit space, you have to be careful with, right? So my training says, I had a certain way that I used to talk and visit and maybe even a behavior with donors than I did with volunteers. So if we just start there and let's just say maybe there's one way that talking about adaptive leadership that you have to be with your board or the business community to make them understand that you have a keen grasp of your core business metrics at your organizations, but not to let them throw you off as to what those core metrics are to your business. And so you need to educate them, most likely. You need to educate them to what those are because they would never understand what your business metrics are. And it's a tough process, surely, right? Because my guess is they don't hear you. You could tell them what those are, and they probably still don't hear you. But that doesn't mean that you can get off track. You can only measure and have what those things are for your organization, and you can't create those out of nothing because it's something that they're asking for. So, do your job as a leader to try to educate them as to this is what that looks like for us. Do you have recommendations to how we can deepen or better what it is that we do track? And maybe that engages them a bit so that they get a little bit of say. And it's either things that you can do or that you can't do, right? After that, I think you've really, you've done your job. But again, in the public service and the nonprofit space, I'm unsure that you can't have the other part as well. So,
Thank you. Appreciate
of
it.
course. Yeah. Good to see you.
Good to see
Hi,
you.
Carol.
I wanted to piggyback on what you just said. I love that question. And I go back to, now, I'm in philanthropy. So I kind of sit in a sweet spot, but I started out in a nonprofit and doing the hard work. I think the answer may also be is sometimes people don't know what nonprofits actually do in the real work. So while you're trying to have to explain what they're asking for in terms of metrics or this or that, provide them with just an on-site visit of this is what the real work's all about. I think that has tremendous impact. And while we're looking at hard times right now, I think we can't forget why we're doing the work. So I would encourage that as well. I mean, I love, when we go and visit the programs that we're funding, because, I can sit there and get reports all the time, but if I'm not going there and seeing what's actually happening, it's a hard balance, but I would also encourage you to kind of just make sure they know what the real work is. So I just wanted to throw that out there.
Yeah, Carol, first, good to see you, and thank you for that. I mean, who can deny when they see your work in person, especially Tana with the population that you serve? But that mission
Exactly.
moment, the same thing, something that, we used to face at Big Brothers Big Sisters. People can't walk into our office, so maybe this is an additional distinction. People could not walk into the Big Brothers Big Sisters office and see kids there. So we would have to take those donors or those business people to go see a kid with an adult mentor and what was going on between them. And so even if you have to take them somewhere to see what it is that you do in action, goes a long way. And then to Carol's point, maybe they forget about those business metrics or no more.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much, Carol. I appreciate it. And I take it to heart. Thank you.
Maybe time for one more question. If not, I'll let you go early, but if someone's got something burning.
Kenny, I don't have a question. I just would tell you, maybe add, we're talking about crisis, and a lot of times you're using, rightfully so, COVID as an example that affects everybody. Sometimes the crisis happens in a community that affects a limited number of people. I learned a valuable lesson when the bonfire collapsed here. When that happened, my wife kept telling me, Royce, you need to go down there and see what you can do to help. And I kept saying, no, I need to stay out of the way and let the professionals do their job. After about 2.5 hours, she finally convinced me to go down there. They grabbed me immediately, took me inside the security life. Thank God you're here. There's things we can do that assist those people that are doing their job and the professionals. And I think whatever nonprofit we have, if there's a crisis, stop and ask, is this something we could assist with? If so, we could be one of those people that need to be there. And if it's not, then stay out of the way of the professionals. But I realize that, sometimes the nonprofit folks have resources or contacts to individuals. That was part of what they were looking for, is contacts to different people. And it's just interesting when there's a crisis, I just say, make a hard look at whether that's something you could help with.
Yeah, I couldn't have said it any better than Melissa. Hey, good to see you as well. That's powerful, Royce. And again, just kind of back to, we're going through what we're going through as organizations, but back to the COVID piece, those that stepped in, and look at the footing that they have now that came out of that with taking part of that process. So Royce, that's an excellent reminder. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Kenny, for what you're doing, and appreciate today. It was very interesting and informative.
Thank you, Royce. Good to see everyone. Okay, again, just a reminder that we'll look for you next month for our webinar in April. And thank you for your time today. We greatly appreciate you all supporting our work. And it's great to see everyone, and we'll plan on seeing you next time.